There's a specific moment in the lives of certain people when an idea enters their head for the first time and something changes permanently. It is not a dramatic transformation. It is not a religious revelation. It is not necessarily an acute suffering. It's subtler and more lasting than that. It's the feeling that a piece of the puzzle you used to piece together the world has been silently removed, and that without it, the other pieces no longer fit together in the same way. And the worst part is that you can't put the piece back because now you've seen the whole, and seeing the whole is irreversible. The question that produces this effect is not the same for everyone. But there is a category of philosophical questions that has this property more consistently than others. These are questions that do not attack a specific belief you have, but rather attack the structure by which you hold beliefs in general. That don't tell you that you're wrong about this or that, but that reveal that you've never had good reason to have confidence in the mechanism by which you arrive at your convictions. And when this mechanism is called into question, everything that was built on it becomes suspended in the air without support. The question I want to explore here is this. Why do you believe what you believe? It seems simple. It even seems naive. You believe what you believe because you have reasons, because the evidence supports it, because you have thought about it. But when you start to examine where those reasons came from, where the ability to evaluate evidence came from, where the criteria by which you decide what counts as good reflection came from, the answer gets progressively more uncomfortable. And the discomfort is not about any particular belief. It's about the entire process. It's about whether you are in fact the author of your convictions, or whether it is more accurate to say that your convictions have you than to say that you have them. Let's start with something that seems obvious and harmless. The beliefs that you find most obvious, most self-evident, most resistant to questioning are almost invariably the beliefs you acquired first, the beliefs that were in the environment before you had the tools to question them. It's no coincidence. It is the result of how the human brain develops. Young children are biologically predisposed to absorb beliefs from the environment uncritically. This is an adaptive characteristic because it allows rapid transmission of culturally accumulated knowledge. But it also means that the most deeply rooted beliefs in your mind were installed before you had any ability to critically evaluate them. The language you used to think was learned before you knew what a language was. The categories you used to organize experience were passed down through the culture before you had any alternatives. The values that seemed most natural and most obvious were internalized at a time when internalizing was all you could do. And now, decades later, when you use reason to evaluate these values and categories and beliefs, you are using an instrument that was constructed by this very process. The reason you use to criticize your beliefs is itself a belief about how to think, and that belief also came from somewhere. The German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer called this a hermeneutic situation. You never interpret the world from a neutral point of view without presuppositions. You always interpret from a tradition, from a set of pre-understandings that are not consciously chosen, but that constitute the horizon within which understanding occurs. And you can't just step outside that horizon to see the world as it is independently of all interpretation, because any attempt to step outside the horizon uses tools that are also part of the horizon. This is not nihilism. Gadamer was not saying that we cannot know anything. I was saying that human knowledge is always situated, always perspectived, always partially dependent on presuppositions that are not themselves completely justified from within. And this has a consequence that many people find difficult to accept. Their most basic worldview, the one that seems so obvious that it is invisible, is not the view of the world as it is. It is a vision among others, contingent, historical, partial. But let's go deeper, because the problem isn't just that your beliefs came from a specific place. It's that the process by which you evaluate and revise beliefs is also fundamentally non-neutral in ways that cognitive psychology has spent decades documenting. Daniel Kahneman, the Israeli psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on cognition, developed with Amos Tversky a description of human thought that is simultaneously fascinating and devastating to any optimistic view of human rationality. The human thought system, according to Kahneman, operates in two modes. You in a fast, automatic, associative mode that operates below the level of consciousness and produces most everyday judgments and decisions without deliberative effort. It is a slow, deliberative, effortful mode, which is capable of more careful logical reasoning, but which is invoked much less frequently than we assume, and which is easily contaminated by the outputs of the fast mode. Fast mode is the source of most of our cognitive biases. Confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out and weigh more heavily information that confirms what we already believe and ignore or downplay information that contradicts it. Availability bias, the tendency to assess the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind, not based on actual statistics. The anchoring effect, the tendency to be disproportionately influenced by the first information received about a subject. even when that information is irrelevant. Self-perspective bias, the tendency to believe that your perceptions and judgments are more objective and less influenced by bias than those of other people. What makes these biases genuinely philosophically disturbing is not that they exist. It's just that they are largely invisible to those who have them. You don't feel the confirmation bias operating. You feel that you are evaluating the evidence objectively and that it genuinely points to the conclusion you have reached. You don't feel that the ease with which an example comes to mind is distorting your probability judgment. You feel like you're making a reasonable judgment about how common something is. The subjective feeling of having reached a conclusion rationally and objectively is not evidence that you actually reached it rationally and objectively. This raises what is perhaps the most disturbing form of the question we began with. When you use your reason to evaluate whether your beliefs are justified and come to the conclusion that they are, how do you know that this evaluation process has not itself been distorted by your biases? You cannot use reason to check whether reason is working correctly without presupposing that reason is working correctly. It's like trying to calibrate the thermometer using the thermometer itself. American philosopher Richard Rorty took this type of argument in a direction that many found liberating and others found terrifying. Rorty argued that there is no neutral point of view without vocabulary, without presuppositions, from which you can objectively evaluate different worldviews. There is no such thing as the way things really are independently of any description. There are just different vocabularies, different ways of describing and organizing experience, which serve different purposes better or worse. This does not mean that all worldviews are equally good. Some vocabularies serve certain purposes better than others, produce more effective technologies, enable more efficient cooperation, reduce suffering more reliably. But it does not mean that one worldview is objectively truer than another in the sense of better corresponding to reality, as it is independently of any perspective. Correspondence with perspective. Independent reality is an ideal that has no real content because we do not have access to any reality that is truly perspective independent. This is where the philosophical question really starts to ruin it. Because most people have a worldview that includes the belief that this worldview is not just one perspective among others, but a perspective that is genuinely closer to the truth than the alternatives. The Christian does not just believe in Christianity, believes that Christianity is true in a way that Islam and Buddhism are not. The scientist does not just use the scientific method, believes that the scientific method reveals the world as it genuinely is in a way that magical thinking does not. Liberals don't just have liberal values, believes that these values are justified in a way that authoritarian values are not. And the ruinous question is not whether these beliefs are correct or not. It's, why do you have these specific beliefs and not others? And when you answer, why do you believe the reasons you give? And when you answer that, why do you believe the criteria you use to evaluate reasons? At some point, the chain ends not in an ultimate universal justification, but in something that you simply accept that seems obviously right, that was internalized before you had the ability to critically evaluate it. Philosopher Wilfrid Sellars called this the myth of the given. The idea that there is some starting point for knowledge that is absolutely immune to revision and that serves as the foundation for everything else. A pure, uninterpreted experience, self-evident axiom, an irresistible moral intuition. Sellars argued that no such starting point exists. Everything is subject to review in light of other things we believe. There is no ultimate and unquestionable basis on which we build knowledge. Knowledge is more like a network without a foundation than a pyramid with foundations. But if there is no foundation, what sustains the network? The answer from Sellars and other philosophers in the same tradition is internal coherence, compatibility with experience, practical utility, and the process of mutual revision and intersubjective critique over time. Not an absolute guarantee, not a verifiable correspondence with reality as it is in itself. But something more modest and more honest, a relative, conditional justification, always open to revision. American philosopher Nelson Goodman reached a conclusion that many people find impossible to swallow but very difficult to refute. There is no single world that all correct descriptions describe. There is a multiplicity of versions of the world, each produced by a different set of concepts, categories, and forms of organization, and each correct within its own terms. The world of physics is not the same as the world of common sense, which is not the same as the world of music or the world of literature. They are not different descriptions of the same world. They are different versions of the world, each one real and correct within the frame of reference that constitutes it. This seems to open the door to a complete relativism where any worldview is as valid as any other. But Goodman insisted that was not the case. Some versions of the world are correct and others are not, each within its own terms. What does not exist is a neutral meta-point of view from which all versions can be evaluated and classified in a single hierarchy of proximity to absolute truth. Goodman's pluralism is rigorous and not easy. It is not the intellectual permissiveness that anything goes. It is the recognition that different cognitive projects produce different versions of the world that cannot all be reduced to a single final version. To understand why all of this has the power to ruin a worldview, you need to understand what most worldviews presuppose about themselves. Most coherent and held worldviews include, implicitly or explicitly, the belief that that worldview is privileged in some way. That your core beliefs are not just personal preferences or cultural conventions, but truths about the world that any rational person looking honestly would arrive at. That there is an asymmetry between what you believe and what others believe that goes beyond a mere difference in perspective. And what philosophy reveals, when you take it seriously, is that this privileged self-image is not as justified as you thought it was. Not because you are necessarily wrong about the things you believe, but because the processes by which you arrived at these beliefs do not have the transparency and objectivity that you assumed. Because the criteria it uses to evaluate beliefs also came from somewhere and also need justification. Because the feeling that a belief is obviously right is not evidence that it is right in a way that transcends perspective and context. What to do with this discovery? There are at least 3 possible answers, and each reveals something about how different types of people deal with the impossibility of an ultimate foundation. The first is what we might call epistemic nihilism. If there is no ultimate foundation, then nothing is truly justified. All belief is equally indefensible, and the project of seeking truth is simply futile. This response is psychologically understandable, but philosophically wrong. That there is no ultimate foundation does not mean that all positions are equally justified. It means that justification is relative, conditional, and reviewable, not that it is non-existent. The absence of absolute does not imply nihilism. The second is what we could call epistemic fundamentalism, faced with the vertigo of having no foundation, deliberately choosing a foundation and treating it as if it were absolute, actively resisting any questioning. This response is psychologically very common and serves important functions of coherence and identity. But it comes at the cost of closing off the possibility of revision and intellectual growth, and of treating something that is genuinely contingent as certainty. The third answer, the most difficult and the most interesting, is what we might call committed epistemic fallibilism, accepting that your beliefs do not have the absolute foundation you assumed, but remaining committed to them in a reviewable way, maintaining genuine openness to the possibility of being wrong while acting on the basis of the best available judgment. This position is intellectual, currently honest, but psychologically demanding. It requires a way of living with uncertainty that goes against the cognitive security instincts that most people have. The pragmatist American philosopher William James wrote that our beliefs are like tools, and a belief is good to the extent that it works, to the extent that it allows us to navigate the world effectively, establish relationships with others, create works, reduce suffering. This does not mean that any belief that works for you is true for you. It means that the evaluation of beliefs is always partially an evaluation of instruments and contexts of use, not just a verified correspondence with an absolutely independent reality. And what remains after the question ruins the worldview is exactly that. Not chaos, not nihilism, not paralysis, but a different relationship to your own beliefs. A more humble, more curious relationship, more open to the possibility that people who think differently than you are not simply wrong or uninformed or malicious, but inhabit a different version of the world that has its own internal coherence and its own criteria of validity, and that the conversation between these different versions, when it is genuinely honest and open, is perhaps the closest thing human beings can come to something that deserves the name shared truth.